Hey guys, what's going on? James here, and welcome to a very special video. This is the first video in a series of videos which is going to be titled The Greatest Tampa Bay Buccaneers of All Time. That's right. I have decided to start a series where I go through each and every position and label the greatest Buccaneer of all time at that one specific position. So, today we are going to be starting with the most obvious position, the quarterback position. So when you're talking about the quarterback position, there's a lot of names that you can give, and a couple of honorable mentions are obviously Brad Johnson, who won the Tampa Bay Buccaneers one and only Super Bowl back in 2002, but that's not who I selected. Then you have a couple of younger franchise options that the Bucs had. Most currently, Jameis Winston's an honorable mention, and then the guy who was before him, Josh Freeman. Those are a couple of guys who are pretty highly up there in the statistical categories. But, they still, for Josh Freeman's case, he didn't really have much of a legacy, and then Jameis Winston's still working on his. And then you have guys like Vinny Testaverde, who, he was significant because he was the Bucs' first #1 overall pick that they used on a quarterback, and that's a big deal. But again, it was just kind of a situation where he does hold a handful of Buccaneers passing records, but he didn't do anything that was too significant, maybe like Brad Johnson. I heavily considered Brad Johnson here. But I decided to not go with Brad Johnson, Josh Freeman, Vinny Testaverde, or even Jameis Winston. I decided to go with a guy a little bit more influential, a guy who was there right from the beginning of the roots of the Buccaneers franchise. Not right away in 1976. No, this man came along in the 1978 NFL draft. That is right, guys. I am talking about the 17th overall pick in this draft, and arguably the first Buccaneers franchise quarterback. It's Doug Williams.
Williams under pressure, comes out of the pocket. Williams to the 5, Williams 35-yard line. Buccaneers haven't had the ball much. Nice fake by Williams, and he goes long. That is caught, and that is at the goal line. Owens.
He has something to prove today, and I guess you show the whole country you can play quarterback, hey, Doug?
Yeah, I had some pretty bad weeks in the following week, but this one week everybody relaxed and just took it to him.
The first half, you were just...
Now, I decided to pick Doug Williams just because of the amount of significance that he had for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, prior to Doug joining the team, the Buccaneers were not a good team under any circumstances. They had only been in this league for 2 years. They had joined as an expansion team with the Seattle Seahawks. In their first season, they did not win a single game, and in their second season, they only won 2 games. So the past 2 seasons prior to Doug Williams joining in 1978, the Buccaneers had a record of 2-26. So what can we gather from Doug Williams? What did he do that made him so influential? Well, like I said a few minutes ago, Doug Williams is kind of this first prototypical franchise quarterback for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So let's go through year by year. He was only with the Buccaneers 5 years, but granted, the Buccaneers haven't exactly had a long-term quarterback ever in the history of their franchise. So the fact that he was with them for 5 years, that's kind of the average. That's kind of better than a decent amount of quarterbacks that the Bucs have had. Josh Freeman was only there for 5 years. Vinny Testaverde was only there for 5 years, and kind of the same with Brad Johnson. Hopefully Jameis Winston can break this mold, but at the time, that was a big deal that the Bucs had a quarterback for 5 years because he was kind of there for the beginning stages of this Buccaneers franchise. So in year 1, the Bucs won 3 more games than the past season with Doug Williams at the quarterback position. He didn't exactly have the most glamorous numbers. He did at times throw more interceptions than touchdowns, but that's just kind of how the league was at that time. It was definitely a more run-committed style of league, which is fine. If you have a competent... Basically, what you wanted was a game manager and a guy who is still a pretty decent passing quarterback, but you didn't need them to carry carry your team. And that's what Doug Williams was for this team. So his first year, they did end up winning 3 more games than they did the previous season. Moving on to the second year, now this is where things get pretty darn interesting in my opinion. The team wins 10 games and goes to the playoffs for the first time in the team's history. So let's just think about this, okay? You have 1976, the franchise is born, they go through their first season. 1977, that's year 2. 78, Doug Williams joins the team. Okay, 1978, he joins and he plays in the 1978 season. 1979, you know, he takes them to the playoffs, and they make it as far as the NFC title game where they lose to the Rams. That's how far they got with this playoff run with a second-year quarterback. That's a pretty big deal. You know, and in just their 4th year as a franchise, they're in the NFC title game. That's pretty decent in my opinion, especially considering that their first 2 years, they only won 2 games. To go from that to going to the NFC title game only 2 years after that, that's a pretty darn impressive feat in my opinion. Moving on to year 3, things did kind of take a step back as the Buccaneers only would win 5 games that year, so 5 less games than they won the year before, but you could tell still things were doing pretty okay. Doug Williams was still doing all right in my opinion. Moving on to year 4, the Buccaneers are back in the playoffs with 9 wins, and they make it to the divisional round where they lose to the Dallas Cowboys. So again, the Buccaneers are back in these playoffs. You know, they're still a very young team. They're still in their infancy as a franchise, and you're going to the playoffs, you know, 2 out of 3 years with this, what you would assume at this point is your franchise quarterback. If he leads you to the playoffs 2 out of his first 4 years, that's pretty darn good in my opinion. And then finally, in year 5, they are back again in the playoffs. They're in the playoffs again with a 7-6 record. They make it into the wild card, but they lose in round 1 to the Dallas Cowboys. So in his first 5 and only years with the team, he took the Buccaneers to the playoffs 3 times. That's pretty good considering, you know, it was a different type of league back then. It was definitely more run-oriented. And, you know, he's kind of done something that, you know, we haven't seen like a young franchise quarterback do with the team, and that's he consistently would either A, be in the running to go to the playoffs, or B, he just took them to the playoffs. Obviously, he had 2 years where he only won 5 games, but he went to the playoffs more than he didn't in his time with Tampa Bay. That's pretty impressive. Now, what's really interesting about Doug Williams is not just what he offered to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but what he offered to the league in general. You see, at the time, Doug Williams was the only starting African-American quarterback in the league, and he was making $120,000 a season, which was the lowest salary out of all the starting quarterbacks in the league at the time, and it was actually lower than 12 of the NFL's backups during that time as well. So when it came time for a new contract, Doug Williams wanted his money, and he wanted it now. Now, Doug Williams wanted a pretty reasonable contract, in my opinion, a $600,000 contract, but the owner at the time, Hugh Culverhouse, would not budge from his offer of $400,000. Now, this was a really big deal because, like I said, Doug Williams was kind of the first franchise quarterback the Buccaneers had ever had. And the coach at the time, John McKay, who was actually with the Buccaneers for a very, very long time, really wanted Doug Williams back on the team. And he was saying, please, Hugh Culverhouse, please get Doug Williams back on this team. Culverhouse said no. And Doug Williams eventually left, and he joined the everly budding, I think it was the United States, it was like USA Football League or something along those lines. He joined them for a year, and then he would eventually join the Washington Redskins, where he would take them to the playoffs a couple of times and eventually win a Super Bowl with them. Now, a lot of people criticize Hugh Culverhouse and say, like, why, what is wrong with you? You know, how could you make such a foolish mistake and not pay Doug Williams this money? And a lot of, it did not help under any circumstances that Doug Williams' wife had just recently passed away as well due to a brain tumor. So a lot of people saw Hugh Culverhouse as kind of just a callous, just really cheap, really insensitive kind of guy. And I kind of have to agree with that, you know. I get it, not paying a quarterback, you know, if you don't want to pay a quarterback. But like I said, Doug Williams was the first franchise quarterback, and it was only a couple $100,000 more, and I get it, it was more money back at the time. But still, if you think you have a franchise quarterback like that who took you to the playoffs 3 out of 5 years and your head coach wants him, you know, why wouldn't you do that? And it adds on because, you know, after this, the next season after they lose Doug Williams, the Buccaneers would only win 2 games that season, and they would not make the playoffs again until the 1997 season after losing Doug Williams. So you could tell how much of an effect he had on this franchise. So going over some stats here, Doug Williams finished with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers with 12,648 yards, which finishes 4th all-time for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He had 73 touchdowns, which is 3rd for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 73 interceptions, which is also 3rd for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he had a final record of 33 wins, 33 losses, and 1 tie, which is the 2nd best record ever by a Tampa Bay Buccaneers starting quarterback. So really, it was kind of weird, you know, 73 touchdowns, 73 interceptions, 33 wins, 33 losses. That's kind of weird in my opinion. I kind of like that because it just looks cool. But all in all, you know, final thoughts on Doug Williams. He broke the mold. He was kind of a pioneer for a different mindset of thinking in the NFL. And he was, you can, you know, not argue, you know, it's pretty apparent, you know, and it's obvious. He was the first franchise quarterback for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He took them to the playoffs, you know, 3 out of his only 5 years with the team. Culverhouse did not want to pay him money at the time, despite his head coach saying, yeah, this guy's really pretty good, and he's led us to the playoffs 3 years out of his first 5. We should probably keep him, but didn't happen, and he would eventually go on to win a Super Bowl with the Washington Redskins. So what can you do? Just kind of typical Buck stuff. You know, you don't want to pay a guy, and then they end up going off and being great. It happens all the time for us, kind of. But yeah, let me know what you guys think of the former 17th overall pick in the 1978 NFL Draft, Doug Williams, my pick for the greatest Tampa Bay Buccaneers quarterback of all time. Do you agree with the pick? Do you disagree with the pick? You know, maybe you think it's Brad Johnson, or maybe you think it's Trent Dilfer. You know, maybe it's some of these guys. Maybe you think it's Josh Freeman, but I don't know. You know, there's definitely a lot of names out there. Vinny Testaverde, some other names I'm sure are definitely out there that you guys will remind me of. But let me know down in the comment section below if you agree and why you agree, or if you disagree and why you disagree. You know, I love discussing this kind of stuff with you guys, and I can't wait to continue this series next time with the running back and fullback position. So yeah, hope you guys all enjoyed, and as always, I will see you in the next video, but until then, goodbye for now, guys. See ya.